Hello, welcome to the channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and don't forget to write a comment. Enjoy watching.
When his father raised a glass and toasted, "To my son, who always settles for less," I laughed too, out of shock. His mom winced. My fiancé, my soon-to-be husband, laughed like it was the funniest damn thing he ever heard. So I smiled, stood up, slid off the ring, and handed over a sealed envelope I'd been carrying for weeks. I didn't say a word, but when they opened it, his mother screamed. And his father, he just sat there, glass frozen midair, like he'd seen a ghost. Let me take you back 2 months, to when I figured out just how little they thought of me and how I planned my way out, one quiet move at a time. It started on a Wednesday evening in early fall, the kind of day when the leaves were just beginning to dry and crack underfoot, and the sky felt permanently stuck somewhere between daylight and dusk. Ben had invited me to his parents' house for dinner. Nothing special, he said. Just a casual family night, like the ones they used to have every other week before we both got too busy being adults, as he liked to put it with a crooked grin. I remember the way he looked at me when I asked what the occasion was. He gave me that offhand shrug that always used to charm me, but that night, for reasons I couldn't articulate then, it felt like a brush-off instead of affection. We pulled up to the house, a large colonial-style home on a tree-lined street in the kind of neighborhood where people power wash their driveways and wave at each other from riding lawnmowers. I remember staring up at the white columns and thinking, as I often did, how this place never felt like it had a door open for me. Not really. I could enter it, yes, I could smile at the people who lived inside, but there was always a tightness in my chest, like I had to hold my breath the entire time I was there. I'd walk in and come out the same, only a little more diminished each time, like someone had quietly shaved a sliver off my self-worth and pocketed it without saying a word. Karen, Ben's mother, answered the door with a forced warmth that smelled like perfume and Pinot Grigio. She kissed me on the cheek, held me at arm's length, and said, "Lauren, you look so cozy." She smiled as she said it, but I'd heard that word enough times from her lips to know what it meant. Not fashionable, not elegant, not polished. Cozy was a gentle stab in the gut with a pillow behind it. Inside, the house smelled like butter and rosemary, and Frank Sinatra crooned from the Bluetooth speaker they always used on fancy nights. Ben's father, Mark, stood in the kitchen, swirling bourbon in a glass like he was starring in a commercial for casual alcoholism, and gave me a nod before asking Ben if he'd remembered to bring the scotch for the men. That little phrase should have set me off then, but I smiled, the way women are trained to smile when the insult is too small to name. We sat down to dinner, and the table was perfectly set, as it always was, with silver napkin rings and name cards, and more forks than anyone needed. Karen served beef tenderloin and truffle potatoes, and as she laid my plate in front of me, she leaned in and whispered, "I made yours without the sauce. I know how you teachers like to keep things simple." I forced a laugh, the kind that burns in your throat, and thanked her. Ben didn't say a word, and that was the beginning of the unraveling, even if I didn't know it yet. The conversation danced between polite and uncomfortable for most of the meal. Chad, Ben's brother, talked about his new business project, which seemed to be an overpriced self-help course for men who still lived in their parents' basements. And Karen kept steering the talk back to Ben's accomplishments. His job at the consulting firm, his golf handicap, his growth trajectory, whatever the hell that meant. No one asked about my work. No one asked about my students or the after-school program I'd started or the fellowship I'd applied for. I might as well have been a ghost in a sweater dress. Then it happened. Mark raised his glass, leaned back in his chair like a smug king surveying his court, and said with that fake fatherly grin, "Here's to Ben, who always brings home someone nice, maybe not the fanciest, but solid, reliable, someone who keeps his feet on the ground. A real salt-of-the-earth kind of girl, to my son, who always settles for less." He chuckled like it was the funniest thing he'd said all night, and the room followed. First Karen with her tight, nervous laugh, then Chad with his loud bark, and finally Ben, my Ben, laughing like he'd been waiting for that line the whole evening. It wasn't even a surprise laugh. It was familiar. I sat still. I didn't flinch, didn't frown, didn't drop my fork or storm out or make a scene. I just sat there, smiling with my mouth but not my eyes, and watched them. Watched how no one corrected him. No one tried to soften it. And Ben didn't even look at me. That moment, those 10 seconds of laughter and silence, were the clearest mirror I'd ever been handed. I wasn't part of this family. I was a prop they were using to feel better about themselves. I waited until dessert. Karen brought out some kind of deconstructed cheesecake nonsense and started talking about flower arrangements for some fundraiser they were hosting. I excused myself to the bathroom. I didn't cry. I thought I would, but I didn't. Instead, I pulled out my phone and opened my notes app. I typed 6 words. They've told you who they are. Then I locked the screen and stared at myself in the mirror. I remember thinking how tired I looked. Not exhausted like after a long day, but worn out in that way that happens when people chip away at you for too long and you've let them. When I came back to the table, Ben looked up and asked if I was okay. I smiled and told him I was fine. In that moment, I realized he didn't actually care if I was or wasn't. He just wanted to know if I was going to make a scene. And I decided, right then, I wouldn't. Not here, not now. But one day I would give them a scene they'd never forget. So I stayed sweet, polite, agreeable. I laughed at the right moments, offered to help with the dishes, hugged Karen goodbye, and told Mark, "Thanks for dinner, it was memorable." He grinned, clapped Ben on the back and told him, "You've got a good one, son. Don't screw it up," as if he hadn't already made it crystal clear that he didn't think I was good enough in the first place. Ben and I drove home in silence for a while. He finally said, "That went pretty well, right?" And I just nodded. I think that was the moment the last little thread of love I had for him snapped. Not because of what his father said, but because Ben heard it, laughed at it, and still thought the evening was a success. That kind of blindness doesn't come from cruelty. It comes from comfort. He was comfortable with their contempt. He'd accepted it a long time ago, and now he expected me to do the same. I didn't argue, I didn't bring it up, I didn't demand an apology or start a fight. I just smiled again, leaned over, kissed his cheek, and told him I was tired. I turned away and stared out the window the rest of the ride home, watching the houses pass like shadows, and thinking not about leaving, but about how. Because from that moment forward, I knew I couldn't marry this man, but I also knew I wasn't going to run. I was going to stand up and walk out, on my terms and in a way they'd never forget. Looking back now, it's painfully clear that the dinner wasn't the beginning of anything, but rather the middle of something I'd been too distracted or too hopeful to see for what it really was. It wasn't the first time Ben let things slide, and it wasn't the first time his family had poked fun dressed as charm, veiled insults sewn into casual remarks with just enough sweetness to be brushed off. But something shifted that night, not in them, not in him, but in me. I stopped doubting what my instincts had whispered all along, and instead of confronting it head on, instead of burning down the room with a confrontation that would only end in gaslighting and faux apologies, I decided to watch, to listen, and to gather the pieces I would eventually use to build my way out. In the weeks that followed, Ben was back to his usual rhythms, kissing my forehead in the mornings, forgetting to take out the trash, bringing home Thai food when he knew I was too tired to cook, and always saying "I love you" right after he made a mistake, like it was a safety net that erased the stumble. And yet, even in the smallest details, I saw the cracks that had always been there, but that I now chose not to ignore. It was in how he answered the phone with a different tone when it was his mother, how his shoulders straightened like he was being measured by an invisible ruler. It was in how he always looked at me after one of their family gatherings, as if assessing whether I had been acceptable enough, whether I had kept my mouth shut, smiled enough, worn the right thing. I started to realize that I had become a kind of silent performance, a character he paraded around to maintain peace between the woman he claimed to love and the people who still saw me as temporary, as some phase he'd outgrow when it stopped being convenient. One night, while he was in the shower, I picked up his phone. Not because I didn't trust him in the way women are always accused of being irrational and paranoid, but because I knew what trust really was now. It was no longer blind faith. It was accountability paired with transparency. And in our case, I was missing both. I opened his messages, not expecting anything explosive, not even looking for infidelity, but just curious. And there it was. 3 days after that dinner, a message from Ben to his mother that said, "She didn't say anything. She's used to being overlooked, I guess." That line did more damage than any betrayal could have, because it told me exactly where I stood. Not just with them, but with him. I wasn't a partner. I was a placeholder, a convenient fixture. That made him look grounded, responsible, like the kind of man who settled down with a nice, stable woman. I was his symbol of maturity, not his equal. I didn't confront him, not that night. Not the next morning either. Instead, I started taking notes. I documented everything, not out of pettiness, but for clarity, because I needed to make sure that when the moment came to leave, I wouldn't look back and second-guess myself. I started a hidden voice journal. Each night after he fell asleep, I'd whisper into my phone like a confession booth. I recorded every word, every interaction, every smile that felt more like a muscle reflex than affection. I even recorded myself reading the message he sent to his mother, my voice shaking at first, then hardening. Around that same time, Ben proposed. It wasn't a surprise. I'd known it was coming. His friends had started hinting, and Karen had dropped not-so-subtle comments about booking venues and saving family heirloom rings. And when it happened, it was everything I had feared. Hollow, scripted, and completely lacking in genuine emotion. He proposed in our apartment kitchen while I was standing barefoot in sweatpants with my hair a mess and dish soap on my hands. He pulled the ring out of his pocket like it was a spare key and said, "Well, I guess it's time." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so absurdly on brand for him that even disappointment felt cliché. He didn't kneel. He didn't look me in the eyes. He just waited for me to say yes, like he was waiting for the microwave to finish reheating leftovers. I said yes, not because I meant it, but because I needed to stay in the game long enough to change the rules. I needed to see how far they'd go, how much they'd reveal when they thought that they'd won. And it worked. Within days, Karen was in full wedding planning mode, calling me with suggestions that felt more like orders. She'd send over dress styles with captions like, "This hides your arms," or caterer options with passive-aggressive notes about budget-conscious choices being more your taste. And Ben, he was completely hands-off, more interested in planning the bachelor party with Chad than in discussing whether we wanted a DJ or a live band. Every time I brought up something meaningful, like writing our own vows or skipping the bouquet toss, he'd say, "Let my mom handle it, babe. She lives for this stuff." But the worst part, the part that made me understand how deep I had sunk into something I hadn't signed up for, was the night I overheard the real plan. Ben was on the phone with Karen, pacing the living room while I sat on the balcony reading. He didn't realize the window was cracked open. I heard him say, "She'll come around. Once we're married, she won't have much choice. She's not like us, Mom. But she'll adjust. I'll make sure of it." I froze. Not out of fear, but out of a cold, expanding clarity. Adjust? I wasn't some piece of furniture being moved to a different corner of their lives. I was a human being with thoughts, opinions, dreams, and limits. And those limits had just been found. That night, while he slept beside me, arm lazily draped over my waist like ownership, I opened a new browser tab and searched for two things: a copyright lawyer and a private investigator. Because you see, I had started to suspect that Chad's business project, the one he'd been bragging about at that dinner, had roots deeper than his supposed inspiration. I had noticed phrases, titles, even whole sections of language that felt too familiar, almost as if someone had been feeding him my material, my work, without ever saying a word. So while Ben dreamed beside me, content and clueless, I started pulling threads, quietly, methodically, and I promised myself that the next time they laughed at me, it wouldn't end with me smiling. It would end with them choking on the punchline. The first time I truly understood what people meant by the phrase death by 1,000 cuts was not during a dramatic breakup or some fiery confrontation where someone screamed and doors were slammed, but rather in the quiet, suffocating stillness of those days that followed Ben's proposal, where I found myself engaged to a man who could look me dead in the eye, kiss me on the mouth, sleep beside me every night, and still talk about me like I was a problem to be solved rather than a person to be loved. The hardest part wasn't realizing he was never going to be my defender. It was realizing he had never been my ally to begin with, that I had confused his calm demeanor and conflict-avoidant nature for kindness, when really it was indifference dressed in politeness, the kind that doesn't flinch when others cut you down as long as he stays clean. It was around this time that the pieces began to come together, not in some neat, dramatic sequence, but like a puzzle I hadn't realized I was working on, until the edges started forming on their own. After overhearing Ben on the phone with his mother, speaking about me like I was a long-term home improvement project, I made an unspoken decision. I would no longer be reacting to their actions. I would start acting on my own terms, collecting each moment of cruelty like a coin in a jar, something I would cash in later for the kind of justice that doesn't come with yelling, but with silence and finality. That was when I remembered something Chad had said at that family dinner, something that had slipped past me in the moment, but now stood out like a blinking warning sign. He'd been bragging about his new book project, this authentic voice of the classroom narrative he was writing, and how he was diving deep into the inner world of public education. At the time, I had rolled my eyes internally, dismissing it as just another one of his shallow ventures, but now it gnawed at me, especially when I remembered that I had recently emailed Ben several drafts of my personal essays for feedback, pieces I had been working on for nearly 2 years, full of stories and phrases that came straight from my classroom, my experience, my soul. It didn't take long to confirm what I feared. I began by checking Chad's self-published blog and social media channels, and the moment I saw a headline that almost exactly mirrored one of my essay titles, down to a metaphor I had crafted while crying in my car after a brutal parent-teacher conference, I felt the kind of cold rage that isn't explosive, but heavy and quiet, like a storm cloud so full it presses down on your chest. Over the next week, I documented everything: screenshots, timestamps, side-by-side comparisons. Then I went to a copyright lawyer, quietly, carefully, pretending I had a doctor's appointment. I showed him my drafts, the metadata, the email trails, and the public posts Chad had published under his name. The lawyer didn't need long. He leaned back, looked me in the eyes, and said, "This is textbook intellectual theft, and you have an ironclad case." But I wasn't interested in courtrooms or dragging them through some public legal drama. No, that wasn't my style. What I wanted wasn't just to win. I wanted them to know I had won, before they even realized a war had begun. So I told the lawyer to proceed with filing the necessary copyright claims and infringement notices. But I asked him to hold off on serving Chad and Ben until a specific date I would provide. That was when I began assembling the envelope, the one I would eventually place on the table at the engagement party, like a loaded gun wrapped in white linen. Inside the envelope, I began to collect evidence, not just of Chad's theft, but of Ben's complicity. I dug through his email while he was out one afternoon, and what I found wasn't just confirmation, it was betrayal so casual it made my skin crawl. He had forwarded my essays to Chad weeks before that dinner, saying, "She's been working on these for a while. Thought they might inspire you." Inspire. That word sat in my throat like bile. But the part that really crushed something inside me was the follow-up. "Just don't tell her I sent them. You know how she gets." That phrase rang in my ears for days. You know how she gets. As if I was some fragile, difficult woman prone to drama, rather than a human being with boundaries and self-respect. I also included a letter addressed directly to Karen, typed and signed, printed on heavy, cream-colored paper that smelled faintly of ink and resolve. In it, I detailed how, 3 months earlier, I had discovered Ben was still carrying student loan debt, a fact he had hidden out of pride, and how, in a gesture of solidarity and faith, I had secretly paid it off using my modest inheritance from my grandmother. I had never asked for recognition, never even mentioned it, because I believed at the time that partnerships were about lifting each other when needed, not scoring points. But now I saw it differently. Now I saw how they had all treated me like the charity case, the outsider, when in fact, I had been holding him up without even asking for a thank you. I added the bank records and a copy of the transfer, stapled behind the letter like footnotes to a truth they had refused to see. To complete the package, I included a photograph of my wedding dress, hanging alone in a second-hand boutique in a different part of town, tagged and priced. I had bought it only a week earlier with their money. Karen had insisted on paying, insisting she had aesthetic standards to maintain. But instead of alterations, I had taken it straight to a local shelter that helped women escape domestic violence. They ran a program that helped women re-enter the workforce and build new lives, and the director had cried when I handed the dress over. I took a picture of the receipt, annotated it with the words, "This helped a woman start over," and placed it carefully in the back of the envelope. And finally, the letter to Ben. I didn't write paragraphs. I didn't rant or lecture or beg him to understand. I simply wrote, "You settled, I didn't." Then I signed my name and left it at that. The envelope sat in my desk drawer for 5 days, sealed and unassuming, while life carried on around it as if nothing had changed. Ben continued to call me babe and talk about honeymoon destinations. His parents sent floral arrangement spreadsheets and playlist suggestions, and I played my part with such convincing ease that not even I could believe the cold fire I was carrying beneath the surface. I answered their texts, nodded at their plans, and even tried on a veil at one of Karen's favorite boutiques, telling her it looked absolutely perfect. She beamed like a mother seeing a dream come to life. I said nothing, because sometimes the most satisfying revenge doesn't come from slamming doors. It comes from quietly walking out and leaving them to open an envelope that does all the talking for you. And when the day came, when the toast began, and the room filled with laughter and champagne, I didn't tremble. I didn't sweat or second guess. I just waited, calmly, patiently, like a woman who knows exactly what's about to happen and has made peace with the storm she's about to let in through the front door. The day of the engagement party unfolded with the kind of artificial elegance that felt almost theatrical in its desperate attempt to mask the rotting tension pulsing beneath the surface, like a cheap perfume sprayed over something decomposing, meant to impress guests who had no idea they were walking into a room on the edge of collapse. It was held in the garden of a country club Karen adored, the kind of place where the chairs are wrapped in white satin, the finger foods come on porcelain trays held by silent waiters in gloves, and everyone acts like they're starring in a Hallmark movie they're too emotionally dead to actually enjoy. I arrived precisely 40 minutes late, which Karen would later call disrespectful, and I would privately refer to as strategically perfect, because by the time I stepped into that manicured garden of false smiles and curated centerpieces, everyone was already half a glass deep into the illusion, loosened just enough to laugh too loudly, to speak too freely, and most importantly, to lower their guard. Ben looked exactly how I expected he would. Relaxed, overly confident, and ever so slightly buzzed, shaking hands with coworkers, patting his friends on the back, talking about wedding timelines as if he were doing the heavy lifting, while I remained the silent shadow in the narrative of his personal accomplishment. He greeted me with a kiss on the cheek and a remark about how stunning I looked, and I smiled in return, with the kind of warmth that masks dynamite, letting his hand settle around my waist. For the photographs that would later be posted, framed, remembered by people who had no idea that everything behind those smiles was already over, already burned, and already buried beneath the surface of a story. None of them would hear until it was too late to do anything but gasp. The party went on, with flutes of champagne passed around, and carefully curated small talk floating through the air like harmless butterflies, as if the people there had been hand-selected not for their closeness to us, but for their ability to play their parts in a production designed to impress. Karen floated from table to table in a lavender silk dress that probably cost more than my car, greeting everyone with that overworked, brittle smile that cracked at the edges if you looked too closely. And Mark, the patriarch with the permanently amused expression, stood by the bar, swirling whiskey in a heavy glass like a man who believed he owned the very air his family breathed. Chad, of course, was holding court with some of Ben's high school friends, making wildly embellished jokes about his latest creative project, which I knew for a fact was built on the skeleton of my work, my words, my pain. And yet, as I walked past him, he had the audacity to wink and say, "Hey, future sis-in-law, excited to be part of this crazy family yet?" To which I responded, "More than you'll ever know," and moved on before he could register the deeper meaning behind it. At one point, a woman I didn't know very well, some friend of Karen's who smelled like coconut and passive aggression, pulled me aside to say how lucky I was to be marrying into such a solid family, and I almost laughed, almost choked on the absurdity of it. But instead, I just nodded and said something non-committal, because I knew what was coming, and it was better than any comeback I could offer in the moment. As the sun dipped behind the trees and the fairy lights came on in strings above the white tent, someone clinked a glass, and I knew the moment had arrived. The speeches. Karen, of course, was the first to stand, thanking everyone for coming, talking about love and commitment, and the joining of two legacies, as if marriage was a corporate merger and I was some unstable asset they were gambling on. She said a few nice things about me, things that sounded carefully edited, as if someone had Googled things to say about a daughter-in-law you don't respect, and handed her a script. Then Chad stood, glass raised high, and cracked some joke about how Ben had finally domesticated a wild one, a line that drew laughter, applause, and a knot in my stomach that I refused to acknowledge, choosing instead to look directly at him and smile, not with joy, but with the calm cruelty of someone who knows how the story ends. And then Mark stood. He didn't rush. He waited until all eyes were on him, until the waiters had paused, until even the birds seemed to stop chirping. He held his glass like a symbol of authority, cleared his throat, and said, "Here's to my son Ben, who has always known how to keep his head down, stay practical, and not let the world's noise distract him from what matters. To my son, who always settles for less." There was a split second where the air felt like it had been punched, where the silence was so sharp it could have sliced through the fabric of my dress. Then the laughter came, not from everyone, but enough to make it clear that they thought it was a joke, a moment of fatherly ribbing meant to be brushed off, laughed through, ignored. Karen smiled like she wanted to die. Chad cackled. And Ben, my fiancé, my partner, the man who should have said something, who should have stood up or even just frowned, instead laughed. Not nervously, not awkwardly, but fully, loudly. Like he agreed. That was the moment. I didn't hesitate, didn't flinch, didn't give a speech or demand silence. I simply reached into my clutch, pulled out the envelope, heavy, sealed, deliberate, and placed it gently on the table in front of Ben. I didn't look at Mark, didn't glance at Karen, didn't even acknowledge the room. I slid the ring off my finger, slowly and with precision, and set it neatly on top of the envelope like punctuation at the end of a sentence no one saw coming. Then I turned, smoothed the front of my dress, and walked away. Not fast, not dramatic, just calmly, like I was stepping out of a room that no longer had air worth breathing. Behind me, the silence stretched longer than anyone expected. Then someone asked, "What's in the envelope?" And I heard the rustle of paper, the confused murmur, the sound of something opening. And then came the scream. Karen. It wasn't a sharp scream of horror or injury, but a deep guttural sound, like something had been torn from her that she didn't know could be taken. Then came the voices, rapid, confused, panicked, chairs scraped. Someone said my name, shouted it, called after me, but I didn't turn around. I didn't need to, because they finally knew. They knew who I was, what I'd done, and most importantly, what I had always been capable of, had they only listened instead of laughed. And as I stepped into the night, the echo of that toast still clinging to the air behind me like cigarette smoke, I smiled, not because it was over, but because for the first time in months, I was finally breathing again. In the hours after I left that party, the echo of Karen's scream still reverberating in the folds of my memory, like a siren that couldn't find rest. I didn't cry, didn't shake, didn't call anyone to explain myself, and didn't feel the overwhelming weight of regret that people so often promise will come crashing in after a grand gesture like the one I'd made. Instead, I drove in silence, the kind of deliberate, purposeful silence that comes not from shock or numbness, but from a long-awaited, fully realized moment of truth. The kind that doesn't need to be narrated or even celebrated, because it's not about vengeance or spite, but about reclaiming something you should have never handed over in the first place, your dignity. I remember the road was mostly empty, just the distant shimmer of headlights here and there, and as I drove through intersections I'd crossed 1,000 times with Ben in the passenger seat, I felt no urge to look back, no longing to call him, to ask if he was sorry or confused or broken. Because I knew that whatever emotion was unraveling inside him now, it wasn't born of love lost, but of control, slipping through his fingers like water he never bothered to hold with care. The man I had almost married had spent months, maybe longer, quietly carving out pieces of me to serve the narrative he wanted to tell. A competent but unimpressive woman, a stable but uninspired partner, a reliable fixture in the backdrop of his life story, where he remained the lead. And the tragedy for him wasn't that I left. It was that I told the story myself, on my terms, in my voice. And I did it in a way that not only exposed every lie, but took away every weapon he and his family thought they had. They opened the envelope with the casual arrogance of people who have never been held accountable, who assume that any sealed letter from me would contain apologies or explanations. Maybe some sentimental nonsense about needing space or feeling misunderstood. But instead what they found was a dossier of quiet rebellion, a carefully organized portfolio of facts, timelines, and choices that together told a story they had never considered, one in which I wasn't the weak, passive outsider struggling to be accepted, but the only one in the room who had seen everything clearly and acted with strategy, intention, and integrity. They read the legal documents first, I imagine, the copyright filings, the intellectual property claims, the cease and desist orders prepared by a lawyer whose signature alone would have been enough to send Chad into a tailspin. And beneath those, the printed screenshots of Ben's emails, where he forwarded my essays to his brother with a casual, "Just don't tell her," as though my writing, my voice, my experiences as a teacher could be passed around like a clever meme to fuel someone else's success. There was no emotion in those pages, no personal accusations or melodramatic language, just hard, irrefutable proof that everything they thought was beneath them had in fact been propping them up the entire time. Karen would have reached for the letter addressed to her next, no doubt expecting something emotional, perhaps a plea or a passive-aggressive goodbye. But what she found instead was a breakdown of the student loan I had paid off for her son, the one they believed was so financially stable, so responsible, so self-made. I had included the bank statements, the confirmation emails, and the line-by-line documentation of how I'd used my inheritance to clear his private debt, a gift given not for gratitude but for partnership, which they had all spat on with smug remarks and thinly veiled disdain. At the end of that letter, I wrote only this: sometimes what you call settling is simply someone choosing you when you didn't deserve to be chosen. And then finally, there was the picture of the wedding dress, hanging beneath the fluorescent lighting of the shelter's donation room, surrounded by plastic-wrapped blouses and second-hand suits, a stark contrast to the velvet-carpeted bridal boutique Karen had dragged me through only weeks earlier. The receipt was taped neatly to the back, annotated with a handwritten note that simply said, "This helped a woman start over." I imagine Karen reading that and, for the first time, understanding that the dress she paid for, with so much pride and control, tahaltag, hadn't become the symbol of a fairy tale she could gloat about to her bridge club, but a tool of liberation, one that wouldn't hang in family photos, but would be worn by a stranger who needed hope far more than I ever needed their approval. And Ben, poor, oblivious, self-convinced Ben, would have turned to the note I left for him last, perhaps expecting an outpouring of emotion, a final declaration of love or pain or betrayal, something he could parse and dissect to understand how to fix or dismiss me. But all I had written was a single line, printed in a large serif font, centered on the page like a title of a story he didn't know he was living in. You settled, I didn't. That was it. No farewell, no explanation, no questions. Because he never earned the right to hear me explain myself, and because I knew that in that one sentence, I had given him the only truth he would ever need to confront. That while he laughed at his father's toast, believing he was sitting in a position of power, it was me who held the match, the gasoline, and the will to burn the whole illusion down without ever raising my voice. In the 6 months that followed, I didn't just move out. I moved on. I transferred schools, took a position in another state, started a small podcast about teaching that gained traction faster than I expected, and for the first time in years, I didn't have to apologize for taking up space. My voice, the one they dismissed, the one they tried to siphon and repackage under someone else's name, became something people listened to on their way to work, something they quoted, something they wrote to me about in emails that said things like, "You put words to feelings I didn't know how to explain." I rebuilt my life not as a response to what they took, but as a reflection of what they never saw. And then one quiet Sunday morning, months after the dust had settled and their world had recalibrated around the wreckage I left behind, I received a message request on social media. It was from Karen. No subject, no pictures, just 6 words. "I understand now. I'm sorry, please. I didn't open it. I didn't delete it either. I left it there, suspended between acknowledgement and silence, like a painting hung in a hallway no one walks through anymore. Because closure isn't something you wait for from the people who hurt you. It's something you create alone when you finally stop asking for it and start living like it's already been given." They called it a betrayal. I called it self-respect. And maybe the real story isn't what I did to them, but what they never thought I was capable of doing in the first place.